Hello, everybody. This is a bit unorthodox, but before we start, just wanted to make a quick official announcement. So you may see the title on your screen. There may be a majority in this room who disagrees with the title on this screen. At Hillsdale College, of course, we encourage healthy debate, so we have two viewpoints today, and it'll be a great time. Of course, he's our guest, Dr. Bush, and we want to treat him as such, so please. We had an event last week in D.C. The crowd was a little riled, so we want to tamp down any hissing or booing. If you have anybody near you who almost does that, kind of grab them before they start. But I think he'll present his convincing case, and we'll go from there. So please help us continue in the courage of healthy debate. The student who will introduce our speaker this afternoon is Cassidy Smith. She is a senior studying psychology, rhetoric, and public address. Psychology and rhetoric and public address. And she's from Hayden, Idaho. Please welcome Cassidy to the podium.
Andrew E. Bush is the Crown Professor of Government and George R. Roberts Fellow at Claremont McKenna College, where he teaches courses on American politics and government. He received his BA from the University of Colorado and his MA and PhD from the University of Virginia. A recipient of the Roy P. Crocker Award for Merit and the Fulbright Teaching Fellowship, Dr. Bush is the author or co-author of numerous books, including Horses in Midstream, U.S. Midterm Elections and Their Consequences, Ronald Reagan and the Politics of Freedom, After Hope and Change, the 2012 Elections and American Politics, Defying the Odds, the 2016 Elections and American Politics, and, most recently, Divided We Stand, the 2020 Elections and American Politics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bush.
Well, thank you, Cassidy, for that very kind introduction, and thank you, Matt, for the words to the audience. I'm not sure I've ever been introduced quite that way. I'm quite certain that I will be the beneficiary of Hillsdale's famed hospitality, and whatever happens, it can't be any worse than the day in 2017 that I wound up caught inside the venue of a speaker who my institute at CMC had invited, Heather McDonald, when it was surrounded by a crowd of about 200 screaming people wanting to get in and do bodily harm. So you can do better than that, I'm quite certain. I do want to tell you how happy I am to be here. I have long admired Hillsdale for its values and its educational mission, and it's really nice to be on campus for the first time. Though I do have to say I was somewhat surprised to find out that in order to drive to Hillsdale, you have to go through Moscow. Well, as you know, the title of my talk is 2020, A Stolen Election, No. But I'm going to start in an unconventional way by telling you what I don't believe first, just to get that out of the way. I don't believe that there is no fraud in American elections, or that fraud never affects election results. I think that's demonstrably untrue. I also don't believe that Democrats were somehow ethically above trying to defraud Donald Trump out of the election. Somehow we shouldn't think about that possibility because they couldn't possibly have tried to do something like that. I don't believe that at all. Throughout his presidency, that consistently showed, in my view, that they had abandoned any sort of ethical constraints in their opposition to the president. When I was first invited here, the suggestion was made that the title of my talk might be Fraud in 2020, No, and I declined that suggestion. The title of my talk is also not Tilted Playing Field in 2020, No, because I do believe the playing field was tilted in ways that I'll discuss in a little while. So what am I arguing? Well, my point is simply this. the election could not have been stolen from President Trump unless it was his to begin with. And there is not any evidence that that was the case. To put it another way, if you have good reason to believe that a candidate would have won, should have won, let's say Ronald Reagan in 1984, had the election in the bag, but the election results showed him losing, then you should be very, very suspicious. If, on the other hand, a candidate seems headed for likely defeat and then, as expected, loses, I would say that the bar is raised considerably for the evidence that one would require in order to believe that he is the victim of election theft. I ran across a quote a couple of days ago. You may or may not like the author of this quote. I don't really know anything about him other than that he's a Michigan state senator and he's the chair of the Senate Oversight Committee, Edward McBroom. But in regard to this very issue, he did say at least one thing that I found valuable, and that was that claiming to find something extraordinary requires first eliminating the ordinary. To put it simply, I don't believe that anyone should have expected President Trump to win, and he never came close to providing the degree of evidence for a stolen election that one should require under those circumstances. The election, in other words, was never his. So why do I say this? Well, we can start with the president's average job approval ratings throughout his time in office. This is from the website Real Clear Politics, which I think is pretty even-handed. They're straight shooters. They take some polls for their average that lean left. They take some polls for their average that lean right, and some that are kind of in the middle. So if you notice this, I'll use Matt showed me about this. This is great. There's a laser doohickey that I can use. So if you look at this, you'll notice a couple things, right? The black line, the blue line is, black line, I guess it is his approval rating. The red line is disapproval, the people in a poll who would say they disapprove of the job the president is doing. There are a couple of things about this chart that are notable. One of them is that President Trump's job approval rating was never above 50%. His average job approval rating, never above 50% at any point during his presidency, from the first day of his presidency to the last day of his presidency. That's another way of saying that throughout his entire presidency, there was not even one day when it seemed like a majority of Americans thought that he was doing a good job as president. Now, I know that that's very hard to hear if you like President Trump and if you think he was doing a good job or even a great job, but that's the reality of where he was. Worse, for him, what students of public opinion call underwater, that is to say, not only is his approval below 50%, but his approval is below his disapproval. That was true. This chart doesn't quite show it very well, but it was true almost his entire presidency. You have to go to the little part of the chart that's cut off. It's the first 7 days of the president's term in office. During that first 7 days, his approval was higher than his disapproval. From January 27th, 2017, through the remainder of his presidency, the disapproval was higher than the approval. On election day, over there, you can see his approval rating was about 46%, just a shade under that. Now, you might say, Bush, this is just one website. They use a bunch of polls, but they could be flawed. They might even have a reputation for being even-handed. Give us more. So to test this result against another site that posts an average presidential approval rating using a little bit different methodology and maybe a little bit different mix of polls, you can go to the site 538. And it's very different because he uses red and green rather than red and black. Other than that, it's the same picture, right? The president's approval rating is below 50% for his entire presidency, and he's underwater from sometime in the first week of his presidency through the end of his term. On election day, in this website, he had a 44.6% approval rating. If you wanted to consult a third source to do that, you could just look at the Gallup approval rating. Now, I don't have a picture of that because this thought occurred to me after I had compiled and sent this slideshow. But Gallup is a single polling firm, right? It's not an average, it's just one, but they've been in the business longer than anybody. And the Gallup poll is widely considered the gold standard for polling. And if you were to look at the Gallup approval website page, you would find that President Trump's approval rating was below 50% for his entire presidency, averaged 41% over 4 years, and stood at 45% on election day. So a very consistent picture. Along with the job approval rating, there's a second useful measure of a president's standing with the American people. That's what's called the president's favorability rating. This is more of a personal judgment about things like the president's character, his temperament, his likability. And while this measure usually tracks pretty closely with the job approval rating, it doesn't necessarily. So there could be a difference. For example, when the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke, President Clinton's favorability rating fell a lot, even though his job approval rating remained fairly high. So what about President Trump? This is his favorability rating, with black as favorable and red as unfavorable. And you can see that it was below 50%. It was remarkably stable from the beginning of his presidency, which is right here. This actually starts during the campaign of 2016, right? His inauguration is right about there. Tremendously stable, right? It's below 50% his entire presidency. It's actually underwater his entire presidency. He didn't even get a week where it wasn't. And at the end of this period, when he's running for re-election on election day, 40.7% favorability rating. A third key indicator could be how Americans view the state of the country, whether they think the country is going in the right direction or the wrong direction. This is sometimes called by pollsters the right track, wrong track question. This question does not involve the president directly. And there are lots of reasons that you might have a low rating on this. It could be assessments of the president, it could be assessments of Congress, it could be assessments of government as a whole, or even things that are happening outside of government. So it's not quite as precise an indicator of a president's political situation. And in fact, President Obama narrowly won re-election in 2020, despite a majority of Americans saying the country was on the wrong track. However, he won a narrow re-election, right? The third, or one of the three closest in the previous 100 years, and his approval rating was 51% on election day. Any way around, if you're an incumbent, you don't want the wrong track figure to be bigger than the right track figure, right? You might be able to overcome it, but it's a hurdle. It's a big hurdle to overcome if most Americans think things are not going well in the country. So what about President Trump? Here's the right track, wrong track. The right track is black. The wrong track is red. And you can see that throughout his presidency, there was a substantial majority of Americans who thought the country was on the wrong track. And in fact, that was a situation that got worse. You can see there's kind of the middle of 2020. You have pandemic, you have riots, you have all sorts of things like that going on, and it really takes a steep drop. There's a little bit of recovery. But on election day, only about 3 in 10 Americans thought the country was headed in the right direction. Then there was a multitude of national polls testing a race quite directly between President Trump and former Vice President Biden. These polls would ask basically, if the election were held today, would you vote for Trump or Biden? Though the margin varied a bit, throughout the time that these polls were taken, there was never a change in the leader. From the beginning of presidential election polling in the middle of 2019 through November 2nd, when all of that ended, President Trump never led the Real Clear Politics average and never trailed by fewer than 4 percentage points. Trump is red, Biden is blue. And the margin was usually not 4 percentage points. The margin was usually more like 5 to 8 percentage points. Now, this picture does not do justice to the lopsided nature of these polls. From the spring of 2019 until November 2nd, 2020, Real Clear Politics took 230 individual polls. They didn't take the polls, but they used 230 polls that were taken by different polling firms, and they incorporated them into this average. And I looked at them, I counted them, right? That was an exciting job, counting the Real Clear Politics polls from top to bottom. 230 of them. Out of those 230 head-to-head polls between President Trump and Joe Biden, President Trump led 5 of them. And only one of those was in the last 8 months of the election. And it was by 1%, which was within the margin of error. 3 more were tied. The other 222 were led by Joe Biden. And this is confirmed. If your taste does not run to polls, if you're sort of dismissive of polls in general, you can look at another indicator of this, which is the betting markets. Right? There are actually people who keep track of how the bets are going on the election. And some people think this is more accurate than the polls because people are, obviously very interested in making sure they don't make a mistake. They get a lot of information and they lay their bets down, or maybe they just kind of fly by the seat of their pants. But there are some people who argue the betting markets are more accurate. The day before the election, the betting markets, when it all sort of closed, at least as a prediction, you could say, the betting markets considered it a 2-to-1 probability that Joe Biden would win the election. Now, if you were to engage in a thought experiment and replace Trump and Biden with incumbent Smith and challenger Jones, if you didn't know their parties, if you didn't know where they stood, if you didn't know whether you personally liked one or the other, all you knew about them was that Smith had underwater job approval and favorability ratings for his entire presidency. A significant majority of Americans throughout the country thought that the country was headed in the wrong direction. He trailed Jones in 222 head-to-head polls out of 230 out of a 1.5-year period of time. You would not say, I think Smith is on the verge of winning this big. Right? You might say, well, if Smith gets really, really lucky, he might pull a rabbit out of the hat, but you would not expect Smith to win. So far, there might be a couple of objections to this picture, which I will freely acknowledge. One of them would be that maybe the polls are untrustworthy and biased against Trump. Unfortunately, there's no way to test the accuracy of most polls that are taken, the approval ratings or things like that. There are very few solid points of information that you can connect to, right, where you can actually compare the poll to some objective reality that might serve as a kind of anchor for your consideration. There are about 3 of them. Right? One of them was the election of 2016. And if you looked at the national polls, the Real Clear Politics average of the national polls on the morning of that election, what you would find is that the average predicted that Donald Trump would trail Hillary Clinton by about 2 percentage points in the nationally aggregated popular vote, which is exactly what happened. He won because of the way the votes were distributed. All right, we'll talk about that in a minute. But the polls themselves were pretty much right. when it came to estimating the vote shares of the two candidates in 2016. The second anchor where you could say there's some objective reality that you can test against some of the poll results were the midterm elections of 2018. And in the midterm elections of 2018, the Republicans lost 40 seats in the House. And if you look historically at the approval ratings of presidents in the past who have lost comparable numbers of seats, you would see that President Trump's reported approval rating, according to the polls in the fall of 2018, was right in line with that. The third solid anchor that you can look at would be the final Real Clear Politics Trump versus Biden average in 2020, which had Biden leading by 7.2 percentage points. In the end, he would end up leading nationally by 4.5 percentage points. The error was entirely on the Trump side. That is to say, they actually nailed Joe Biden's probable vote percentage almost exactly, but they underestimated the Trump percentage by about 2.7%. There's no way to know whether that error was present in all of the election polls prior to that, or might have bled over into some of the approval polls, or whether that disparity was the result of a last-minute Trump surge, for which there's considerable evidence, that wasn't picked up. It came too late to really be picked up fully by the polls. However, if we want to be generous to President Trump, we can say, okay, we don't know. We're going to give him the benefit of the doubt. We're going to add 2.7% to his approval, to his support, whether it's in approval ratings, favorability, or the head-to-head polls against Biden. We're going to make that adjustment. But the problem is, if you make that adjustment, all of the salient facts that I just summarized are still true. If you add 2.7% to the president's approval ratings, they would still have been under 50% his entire presidency, and underwater for the vast majority of it. Same thing with his favorability ratings. Same thing with the right track, wrong track. And if you added 2.7% to all of the polling averages between Trump and Biden, from the beginning to the end, he would still have trailed from the beginning to the end. Because remember, he was never behind in those averages by less than 4%. The second objection that might be raised is that the presidential election, as we all know, is determined by the electoral vote, not the nationally aggregated popular vote. And so even though the nationally aggregated popular vote correlates with the winner of the Electoral College the vast majority of the time, it doesn't always. And I think there's getting to be, obviously 2 of the times that it hasn't have been since 2000. So you have to look at this. Unfortunately for President Trump, he trailed significantly in electoral vote estimations throughout the race as well. And here, too, the race was remarkably stable. So you can look to the Real Clear Politics average in the electoral vote estimates. They started doing this in January of 2020, and they did it continuously up until Election Day. And what you can see, Trump is the red, Biden is the blue, and those states that were too close to call, they were kind of within a poll's normal margin of error, they're in the gray, the toss-ups, right? In January, Real Clear Politics said, well, Biden is ahead in about 200 electoral votes, Trump is ahead in about 125, and the rest are up in the air. On Election Day, they said 216 for Biden, 125 for Trump, and 197 toss-ups. There had been hardly any movement over the previous 10 months. So, as in 2016, when the election morning forecast left Hillary Clinton leading Trump in electoral votes, but not with 270 yet, it was possible, it was theoretically possible that in fact Donald Trump could run the table and win the election if he won a disproportionate number, a widely disproportionate number of the toss-up states. But it would be an uphill climb. You could think about this another way, and they did right before Election Day. They said, well, what if you take away the toss-ups? What if you just have Biden states and Trump states, and you allocate every state to whoever's leading, even if they're only leading by a tiny margin? There's just going to be a bright dividing line. If you're ahead in a state, we'll count that state as probably in your column. So what did that look like? Oh, this is the no toss-ups. Biden ahead consistently. And on Election Day, they estimated 319 electoral votes for Biden, 219 for Trump. The only two states that were off from this estimate were Florida, which Trump won, even though he was behind slightly in the average of the pre-election polls, and Georgia, which was declared for Biden, even though Trump had been slightly ahead in the average before that. Every other state came out exactly as they had predicted. A more detailed look at some key states is illuminating. There were 6 key states where Biden was declared the narrow victor and where Trump later alleged fraud. These were Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. In 3 of them, Michigan, Nevada, and Pennsylvania, Trump never led the average. He never led the polling average in those 3 states. From the beginning of the time that they started polling in 2019, the fall of 2019, until Election Day. He did show something of a surge in Pennsylvania at the end. He was leading in 3 of the final 6 polls, but the average was still favoring Biden. In 2 other states, Arizona and Wisconsin, where polling had started in October, Trump led the average for short periods. You can see that here. Arizona and Wisconsin. In Arizona, President Trump was ahead in the state average from February 11th to March 6th, and then for a single day on October 29th. Altogether, 25 days out of 379 that there were polling averages. In Wisconsin, I should mention, in the final 7 polls in Arizona, Trump was ahead in 2, Biden in 4, and 1 was tied. In Wisconsin, Trump led from February 26th to March 10th. That is to say, 13 days out of 394 that there were state polls available in Wisconsin. He trailed the rest of the time. Right? And if you look at the final 8 polls in Wisconsin, Biden led every one of them. Now, I think that Wisconsin is hard. It's a hard state to poll. And the state polls in Wisconsin definitely overestimated Biden's lead or underestimated Trump's support considerably. But nevertheless, it's not irrelevant that Trump was never ahead in any of the polls the last 8 in Wisconsin. Georgia was different than the other 5 states. Trump actually was ahead for most of that race. He was ahead throughout 2019 and throughout all of 2020 up until September 30th. On September 30th, he lost the lead. And then there were, over the next 5 weeks, 6 lead changes. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But out of those 5 weeks, Trump led, he was ahead for 7 days and Biden for 27 days. At the end, Trump seemed to regain his footing a bit. He led 4 of the final 6 polls, and he had an average lead of 1.0% on November 2nd. Though he seemed to be in a stronger position there than in the other states, it really did look like a genuine toss-up, one that could easily go either way. Definitely not a Trump slam dunk. So a state-by-state review focusing on the electoral vote, the Electoral College, does not yield a substantially different picture than what the national polls showed. So what about the charges of fraud made by President Trump and others? Well, as I said, I do believe that fraud is a reality in the American electoral system. And I was initially open to the possibility that it seriously affected the 2020 election. However, the strong evidence that Trump was already headed toward defeat means that he had a very high bar of evidence to carry his case, and I don't think he did so. I'll make 3 points about that. First, on the weekend before Election Day, no votes have been counted officially yet. No voting results have been released. On the weekend before Election Day, the Axios news service, which is sometimes useful, sometimes not. I mean, I don't base my case on this, but it's an interesting article that they had. They reported in a November 1st story titled "Scoop: Trump's Plan to Declare Premature Victory" that, quote, President Trump has told confidants he'll declare victory on Tuesday night if it looks like he's ahead, according to 3 sources familiar with the private comments. That's even if the Electoral College outcome still hinges on large numbers of uncounted votes in key states like Pennsylvania. The White House denied this story. But at 2:30 a.m. Eastern Time, on election night, President Trump, seemingly right on schedule, announced to the nation that he had won the election and that this is a fraud on the American public. It's a major fraud in our nation. At that point, all of the key states were undetermined. Hundreds of thousands of votes remained to be counted, and verifiable evidence of widespread fraud could not possibly have been compiled. Consequently, it appeared from the beginning that these were accusations in search of evidence. Second, much of the evidence of massive fraud that was alleged by the president and others was circumstantial and not persuasive. Democrats had loosened election laws in ways that made fraud easier. That is definitely true. But that by itself was not evidence of fraud. Trump had lost while Republicans had gained a dozen seats in the House. But that wasn't evidence of fraud either. The party of the losing presidential candidate also gained House seats in 1988, 1992, 2000, and 2016. Trump won supposed bellwether states such as Florida and Ohio. But the problem with bellwethers is that they're bellwethers just until they aren't. Maine was considered a bellwether until it predicted an elf land and win in 1936. Missouri was long considered the best bellwether state to think about who was going to win or to predict who was going to win the election. It voted with the winning presidential candidate in every election but one, Missouri did, between 1904 and 2004. And the only time that it misfired was in 1956 when Adlai Stevenson, who was from the neighboring state of Illinois, won Missouri with 50.1% of the vote to 49.9% for Dwight D. Eisenhower. So this was a bellwether. In 2008, Missouri voted for John McCain. And it's voted for the losing candidate 2 more times and is now solidly Republican in presidential elections. Not a swing state at all. There was a raft of statistical analyses that emerged purporting to show that Biden couldn't possibly have gotten as many votes as he did because no Democrat before had gotten that many votes, forgetting that no prior Republican had gotten as many votes as Trump either. Voting patterns change, and Trump, I think it must be admitted, was a uniquely polarizing and uniquely mobilizing figure for both sides. Third, the most serious specific charges of fraud were not well supported. Many serious charges were either retracted by Trump's legal team or never brought to court to begin with. Affidavits were retracted frequently. In Georgia, the Trump legal team claimed that up to 144,000 ineligible voters had cast ballots. By spring of this year, that number had been reduced to 12,547, roughly a factor of 12 lower, meaning that Biden would have had to win 94% of those votes to account for his win in Georgia. And that was if the new number of ineligible voters was not also an exaggeration. Of course, the most potentially impactful allegations had to do with the Dominion voting system. For Trump to be defrauded out of the election, Democrats would have had to shift or add tens of thousands of votes across several states. And some, including some prominent members of the president's legal team, suggested that the Dominion voting system had been programmed to reverse votes. That is, to give Trump votes to Biden and the other way around. These fears first came to the fore, you might know, here in Michigan, where the initial vote reports from Antrim County gave Joe Biden an improbable lead in what everybody knew was a conservative county. However, the problem that led to that was quickly caught and corrected, and a hand recount verified that count. Subsequently, an exhaustive audit was done by Professor J. Alex Halderman, one of the nation's top experts in cybersecurity, who concluded that the initial inaccuracies were the result of human error, not of a security breach. A number of news organizations, including Fox News, Fox Business Channel, Newsmax, OAN, and the American Thinker website, were threatened with legal action by Dominion and apologized for allegations that they had publicized. Attorney Sidney Powell, for a time a member of President Trump's legal team, promised in a November 18th news conference to provide evidence for dramatic allegations that the Dominion system had switched millions of votes and was under the influence of Venezuela, Cuba, and China. It's nearly a year later, and no such evidence has been brought forth. To the contrary, Powell, too, has been sued by Dominion for defamation, and rather than take advantage of this golden opportunity to bring her evidence to the public, to show it in court before a watching world, her legal team responded to the suit by saying this. Whoops, not that. No reasonable person would conclude that the statements were truly statements of fact. That was her legal defense to the defamation suit. Not, Dominion is wrong and I'm right, and here's the evidence to prove it, but no reasonable person would conclude that the statements Sidney Powell made regarding Dominion were truly statements of fact. I think it's fair to say at this point, no reasonable person would conclude that Powell's evidence exists. In Michigan, I'm sure you're well aware, Senate Republicans, not the Democrats, Republicans, after an extensive investigation, concluded that, quote, there is no evidence presented at this time to prove either significant acts of fraud or that an organized, wide-scale effort to commit fraudulent activity was perpetrated in order to subvert the will of Michigan voters. In Arizona, there were results of a private audit commissioned by Republicans in the state Senate that are supposed to be released this Friday, just a few days from now. But the process has become so muddled that I'm confident at this point that no one is going to be convinced of anything that they did not already believe. I repeat, no one can say with certainty that there was no fraud in 2020, and I'm not making that argument here. But it is clear that a high bar of evidence has to be required to accept allegations that fraud decided the election, and that bar has not been met. Though it is doubtless difficult to detect fraud, a point that people make all the time. It's not that easy to catch when it happens. It's not impossible. Otherwise, we wouldn't have dozens of stories of voter fraud that were caught over the last few decades, leading to overturned elections and in some cases, prison sentences. Nothing comparable has yet emerged from 2020. Overall, had industrial-scale fraud taken place, one should expect that Joe Biden's exit poll percentages, taken as voters leave their polling places, would be significantly lower than his certified results. which, if there had been fraud, would have included the fraudulent votes. But that was not the case. This is the one that I went past. Oops, there. You can compare Joe Biden's standing and exit polls with these certified results. And you can see that they are very, very close. They're nearly identical. All right. In fact, in Georgia, Joe Biden actually did better in the exit poll by 0.3% than in the certified results. You expect some variation in the exit polls. There are always some errors. So if the election was not stolen from Trump, why did he lose? Well, taking a long-term view, 2020, I would argue, was a classic referendum election. Political scientists have long maintained that when there is an incumbent president running for re-election, the election revolves around voters' judgments about the incumbent. And we've seen what those judgments were like from the beginning to the end. The incumbent, that is President Trump, for all of his advantages, whatever the many things that many people like about him, he never succeeded in building a majority or even a plurality coalition during his presidency. He had no margin for error. And then he had to face re-election under circumstances that were similar in certain respects to conditions that marked other defeated incumbents like George H.W. Bush, Jimmy Carter, or Herbert Hoover. Serious economic troubles, widespread civil disorder, a sense that national crisis was not under control. On top of that, Trump faced at least 3 structural disadvantages that tilted the playing field against him. And here we get to the tilt. One was the national media, which abandoned all pretenses of objectivity. Right? I mean, I think we can all agree to that. Hopefully, I'll agree to that. That was pretty blatant. Another was the successful drive by Democrats to change the election laws in many places, opening up mail voting, which was likely to disproportionately advantage Democratic voters. Often this was done through what are called collusive lawsuits, or sue and settle lawsuits, where some left-wing activist group would sue a local election office or a Secretary of State, and it would be a Democrat, and the Democrat, instead of defending the law in court, would settle and basically give the activist group whatever it asked for. This was also facilitated by the fact that Democrats had run serious campaigns to try to take control of Secretary of State's offices that kind of flew under the radar, and a lot of Republicans were not paying attention to that over the last decade. Finally, Mark Zuckerberg poured $400 million into grants to state and local election offices. Now, they claimed that Republican counties were just as likely to get money as Democratic counties. It's kind of a debate about that, but what's not debatable is that Democratic counties got a heck of a lot more money than Republican counties. And on top of that, these grants oftentimes came with a requirement that the local election offices partner with different liberal activist groups. There was even one case that was described in the book Our Broken Elections by John Fund and Hans von Spakovsky, where the activist, the head of the activist group, actually more or less became the chief elections officer, kind of stepped in and was making the decisions within the election office. And I would recommend that you take a look at that Fund and von Spakovsky book, and also a book that's about to come out, Rigged, by Hillsdale's own Molly Hemingway. If you want to really see how that all worked, I would recommend both of those books. What happened overall in what you might call lawfare and in local election offices was, I think, clearly more crucial than anything that may or may not have happened in the State Farm arena in Fulton County. At the end of the day, Trump also lost because his conduct in office turned many Americans against him, and he lost his hold on key voting groups. He narrowly won among the 3/4 of voters who said that issues were the most important factor for them, but he lost by a 2-to-1 margin among people who said that the personal qualities of the candidates were the most important thing to their vote. And you can see what happened in terms of key voting groups. In 2016, he won independents, probably the most important single group, you could say, in a closely divided partisan country, people who don't have a party. He won them by 4 percentage points. In 2020, he lost independents by 13 percentage points. There were other swing groups, Catholics, for example, suburbanites, who he narrowly won in 2016 and lost in 2020. There were also some groups that were central to his coalition, really crucial parts of his base in a certain respect. Evangelicals, rural voters, military veterans, where his margins, he won those groups in 2020, but his margins were much, much smaller than they had been in 2016. He won rural voters by 27% in 2016, only 15% in 2020. Veterans, he won by 26% in 2016, only 10% in 2020. And he lost 12% off of the margin that he had among evangelicals as well. In conclusion, I would just submit to you that explaining President Trump's defeat does not require resorting to exotic and basically unproven theories. The election was never his, and his defeat can be easily explained by the ordinary operation of American politics, by the unusual tilted playing field that he faced, and by his own unique capacity to mobilize his partisan opponents and to alienate potentially persuadable voters and even some of his own past supporters. Republicans should certainly attend to election integrity going forward. I support the laws that were recently passed in Georgia, Texas, Florida, and elsewhere. I think that they make sense. But I think that if Republicans allow themselves to be overwhelmed or consumed by a sort of bitter backward glare at 2020, they're going to miss some of the true lessons of that election, and they may well miss a crucial opportunity to provide Americans with a constructive alternative to the disaster that is currently unfolding in Washington. I'll be happy to take any questions that you have at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Bush. If you have any questions, please make your way to a microphone. Student questions will be given preference.
Hi. I'm not sure if I'm asking you a question per se, but I need to let you know where most of us stand. I don't know. I'll speak for myself. I do have a question. Wouldn't you, everything that you've just said, wouldn't it be proved the other way if the media is completely on the other side, like you said, and yet you don't count that all the polls are run by media companies, so the tilt is right there. And all these can be explained by the theft that we claim happened. They stole all these votes. I'm from Pennsylvania, where there was 200,000 more votes than there were voters. So if all that you were saying here could be explained by saying that. I mean, it's like a catch-22. We're saying you're explaining why it was not stolen, and we're saying that's exactly why we're telling you it was stolen.
Well, I'm not sure how much of a question that is, but I will say that your observation about the media, I think, is right. They were definitely against Trump. I don't think that explains, let me rephrase this. I don't think that leads to the conclusion that the polls were totally wrong, right? And that somehow Trump was doing really well in public opinion. He was doing really well in his approval rating or his favorability rating or any of those things. There's just no evidence of that, right? I mean, there's no evidence of that. And I think, I did make the adjustment. The polls were off by 2.7% at the end. That was it, 2.7% from the result. And if you make that adjustment, President Trump is still not doing well in public opinion or in any of the polls against Biden. And there are pollsters who lean right? There are pollsters like Rasmussen who is conservative. And he was a lot of his polls were in the Real Clear Politics average. There was only one of them in 2020 that showed Trump ahead, and it was by 1%. So, I understand the frustration because a lot of people are frustrated. Right? I do understand that, but I don't think we can just conclude that the evidence doesn't, that we can just disregard it because it doesn't say what we want it to say.
Thank you for coming out tonight. My question is, so you talked a lot about polls, of course, and even President Obama during his first term as president had a below 50% average approval rating. So, and even you mentioned that polls can sometimes be wrong. So in the case that the Arizona audit does provide some evidence that President Trump could have let in votes, do you think that would justify a further audit of other states of controversy, such as Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, et cetera?
Well, the thing about the audits, yeah, it's a good question. I think that the situation in Arizona is going to actually, whatever the result, whatever they report, I think it's going to not clarify the situation, partly because of the way it was conducted, right? Their initial statement was that they would have the audit done by May, and then that became June, and then it was July, and then it was August, and now it's September 24th that they're supposed to provide a report, and they changed their procedure partway through, right? So, and it's only Maricopa County. So even let's say that they come out and they say, well, we've concluded that President Trump actually had 2,000 more votes than Joe Biden here, that the results were off. The first thing that anyone who doesn't already believe that is going to say is, well, they changed the procedure in the middle, right? So how do we know? The second thing they'll say is, okay, well, what about the rest of the state? You really don't know who won the state unless you do the whole state. You can't just do one county, even though it's a big county. And the whole process has not been a good one. It's not been a clean process in a lot of ways. In fact, I have a quote here from State Senator Michelle Ugenti-Rita, who's a Republican. She supported creating the audit at the beginning, and in July, she said she changed her mind. She said, sadly, it's now clear that the audit has been botched. The total lack of competence by the Senate president over the last 5 months has deprived voters in Arizona of a comprehensive accounting of the 2020 election. So, I think what will happen, I don't know what they're going to say, but I'm quite certain that whatever it is, they're not going to persuade anybody who wasn't already persuaded, because I think it hasn't been done well. And it was a group that the cyber ninjas didn't really have experience in elections, and the head of it had actually tweeted last fall that it was a stolen election. So I think, if you're an independent, forget Democrats, if you're an independent voter, you don't have strong partisan attachments and you're trying to figure this out, if you look at that scenario, you are probably going to just consider it a partisan thing. And polls have shown that people in Arizona, independent voters, tend to see it that way. So I'm not sure how much effect it will have, but we'll see. I mean, we'll see on, supposedly on Friday, there's going to be some kind of report.
Hi there. I'm to your right.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Hi.
What? Okay.
Thanks for coming. My question concerns whether you had seen a statistical model and analysis published by Revolver News, which controlled for race, education, and county level GOP vote share in the past 5 presidential elections. And based on that data, the model predicted Trump, it accurately predicted the outcome in every state in this election, including very closely the vote share of President Trump in those states. The vote share, however, there was a discrepancy between what the model predicted and the reported numbers in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. And of course, you know, those are the states where we saw a lot of the unfortunate behavior, such as in Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court, 2 weeks before the election, suspending signature verification for mail-in ballots. And in Georgia, I believe a proven lie in the early morning, saying that there was a flood and people had to leave the voting center, and that turned out to be completely false. And then, you know, lo and behold, after everybody leaves, the observers leave, we get these results rolling in at 3 in the morning, 3:30. So anyway, my question is, have you seen that statistical model? You know, do you believe that it was valid? Because if so, then a lot of these numbers and the polling data sort of would be proven or would seem unreliable. So, thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure if I've seen that exact model, but I have seen others like it. I've seen, I read Red State a couple times a day, and they have a lot of these sorts of, the blog, the website. They have a lot of these sorts of analyses. And the problem with them is that they're all based on the assumption that whatever happened in the past is what's going to happen in 2020. And yet, we know the turnout was higher. Even if you think there was significant fraud, the turnout was significantly higher than it had been in past elections. And it seems clear that there were some important shifts in voting habits, voting tendencies. The exception, right, these are cases where President Trump did worse in 2016, in 2020 than in 2016. He did better among African American voters, Hispanic voters, and Asian voters. Right, so he did, in some cases, by a little bit, among Asians by, I think, 7 percentage points or something. So, and he did worse among white voters than he did in 2016. There are shifts taking place in the coalitional bases of the parties. And so you can't take what happened in 2016 or 2012 and say, well, that's going to be the basis of our assumption for what should have happened in 2020. Right? And it still doesn't solve this problem, which I alluded to, which is that there should be a disparity between the results and the exit polls if there was, in fact, large-scale fraud going on, and that we just don't see that.
We have time for one last question.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. 2016 was very notable, I feel, for the presence of third parties. People like Gary Johnson and Jill Stein really became a lot more prominent than their parties had in previous election cycles. And so I just kind of wanted to know, like, what you would think third parties played within both the 2016 and 2020 elections.
Excuse me. So In 2016, of course, some Hillary Clinton supporters blamed the third parties for their defeat, which I don't think was correct. If you look at where those voters would have voted otherwise. And the thing about third-party voters is, you know, a very large percentage of them are not going to vote for anyone if they can't vote for their third-party person. The whole reason they're voting for a third-party person is because they can't stand the two major party candidates, right? So, you know, I've never seen any persuasive evidence that the third-party options in 2016 would have actually changed the outcome, although the Clinton folks like to say that. In 2020, you know, they got a lot fewer votes, right, overall. If you look at third-party votes, the third-party option definitely was not as appealing to voters in general. And I think it's because people got very, very serious about politics. And if you were at all conservative, you were not, you know, most people were not going to throw their votes away on like an Evan McMullen in 2016, or even the Libertarian candidate. And most people who were somewhat to the left were not going to throw their votes away for the Greens, right? And the way that they were kind of willing to in 2016 when the stakes didn't seem as high, they might have actually been as high, but people didn't perceive them that way, right? Now, what you can say is that the Libertarian candidate won more votes than the margin in a couple of states, and I'm pretty sure Georgia was one of them. I'm trying to remember now. I think Georgia and Arizona might have been the two cases where the Libertarian candidate won more votes than Joe Biden won by. And so if Donald Trump had gotten all of those votes, he might have won those two states. But there's no reason to believe he would have gotten all of those votes, right? I mean, we've talked about in the previous speaker, libertarians have a particular way of looking at things, and especially people who are willing to vote for libertarian candidates, knowing that they're not going to win, they're trying to make a statement, and so it's not at all clear that Donald Trump would have gotten all, or maybe even most of those people if they hadn't had that option. But you can say that that the Libertarian candidate did have enough votes to account for the difference between Trump and Biden.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Bush.
Thank you. By the way, this was a lot better than Heather McDonald. Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here. Thanks.